The next group of plants that we're going to deal with are the dicots. Now, I've mentioned this before, but I need to point it out again now, that when we talk about the dicots, there's actually two different kinds of uses of that word. Before this class, when you talked about dicots, it was in contrast to monocots. And that would be monocots, the group that we last talked about, versus basically everything else that's a flowering plant. The problem with that is that dicots, as defined in that way, are not traditional distinct monophyletic groups. Instead, they're made up of a few of these sort of ancestral groups, some groups over here, the ranunculales, the nelumbilales, and these sort of older groups, magnolias and things like that. So they fall into that kind of broadly used dicot meaning, but if we're talking about true dicots or the eudicots, then we're talking about a much narrower range of plants. Those are going to be the true dicots. Now this true dicot group is a monophyletic group, so we're going to be referring to this from here on out. They have some things that make them a little bit unique. When we talked about monocots before, we said these guys have one hole or opening in the pollen grain, and these guys, everybody else, these traditional dicots anyway, have multiple holes in the pollen, so they are the tricolpate pollen group. But we're not going to get into pollen too much more for the rest of the time. Instead, we're going to talk about the diversity of all these plants in this grouping. So the dicots, the eudicots, are highly, highly diverse, even more diverse than the monocots are. They're also extremely abundant. There's a wide variety of both the places that they occupy, the habitats that they can be found in, and the kinds of life forms that they have. So there's much more life diversity or lifestyle diversity in the dicots than there were in the monocots. And there is a high value of utility in this plant group as well. So we're going to return to this phylogenetic tree that we've been using before. Now this tree, we've covered a lot of these other lineages. We're going to skip a lot of these other groups here, although there are some important species kind of here and there, some that you'll be learning in lab identifications. And what we're going to do in today's videos is we're going to cover a couple of these sort of core eudicot lineages. And then we're going to deal with this large group known as the rosids. So this large lineage right here. First we're going to go into this group right here called the Caryophyllales. Now there's a lot of families in this group. But of all these families, we're going to skip through everything and just focus on some of the ones that are going to stand out a little bit more. And let's focus just on this group, the family Cactaceae. Cactaceae should be pretty obvious, the cactus family. Now, lots of things have succulent leaves and are not in the Cactaceae, but one of the things that is true of everything that's in the Cactaceae is that they all have succulent leaves. So if you want to think of one representative of the Cactaceae, you can think of prickly pear cactus, a species that we've seen out in the field. They all have succulent stems, and the stems actually are a source of photosynthesis. Most of the photosynthesis is done in stems. The leaves are reduced into these little needles or these spines, and so here this is a reduced leaf, that is a node, that is another node, and so those little leaves, the spines come out at those nodes. There's a good deal of cacti throughout the world, but you can see that there's very few in Australia. Well, there's none native to Australia or New Zealand. Very few native species all throughout Eurasia. There's some cacti in sub-Saharan Africa, but mostly these are a New World lineage. So, something to note about Cactaceae, New World lineage. There's about 1,500 species throughout the world, but most of those are in North and South America. There's about 174 species in the US alone, which is pretty good. We only have 3 species in Alabama, not a lot. Now, what use do they have? Mostly they're ornamentals. There are some food uses of especially prickly pear cactus. I've seen them made into fermented beverages, into food. So the food nopales, if you ever see nopales, very delicious edible cactus dish. So they're an interesting group, not just from those standpoints, but also because they have a special kind of photosynthetic pathway known as the CAM photosynthetic pathway. There are a couple other species groups that also use this pathway, but is involved independently here. Most of these plants occur in xeric habitats, which mean dry habitats, so they tend to be associated with desert-like conditions that you would usually think of cacti in. And this form of photosynthesis is very efficient in terms of water use. It's not super efficient in terms of sunlight, but sunlight is never limiting for these things. What's limiting the growth of plants in really dry habitats is, of course, water availability. So this form of photosynthesis is very effective in dry areas. And we won't get into the plant physiology of that now. And even though there was a huge number of plants and all of these other eudicot groupings right here, all these other lineages, we're going to skip over all the rest of these, and now we're going to start to focus on this rosid order. And we don't need to worry about how these are broken down into rosid 1s and rosid 2s and ancestral rosids, so we're just going to skip right ahead to just call all of these rosids. And we're going to focus on a few of these families. These are the more common families that you're going to run into. We'll just touch upon a few of those for the material for the class this time. Let's start off with the Vitaceae. Now, the Vitaceae you'll recognize as being members of the grape family. What's really important about grapes is obviously grapes. Grapes get used for wine, they get used for food. Culturally is a highly, highly important family, especially if we're talking about the production of wine throughout the world. Now it's a little weird on this map. I'm not sure what sort of burp happened when I got this, but when I first saw it, you can see that Italy, France, Spain, the areas of Europe where you would typically associate wine production with, there are no native grapes. I can assure you that that is an error of the map. That is not true. There are lots of grapes that are native to Europe. But most of the world's grapes are not native to Europe, the members of the grape family, that is. And so it includes things like muscadine, which we have growing here, but it also includes things like Virginia creeper. There's about 800 species of grapes throughout the world, 40 in the US, 16 in Alabama, which is pretty good. All of them are woody vines, and so what we mean is that the stem is both a vine, but it's also a perenniating structure. So new leaves will grow out of this woody material every year. Now, oftentimes these vines will grow way up high in the canopy of trees, and they're not parasitic, but they're using those trees to elevate them into a place where they can get more sunlight. But you can imagine that very small stem, very small in cross section of a grapevine is under enormous pressure. So remember that it's funneling water upwards to the leaves. There's an enormous amount of pressure in these vines. So what's unique about these besides the production of wine? Well, it's kind of related to the production of wine. All of the fruits of members of this family are berries. So that turns out to be useful, and we consume them quite a bit. As we move on through the rosids, the next group that we're going to talk about is the Fabaceae. Now, the Fabaceae turns out to be a super, super important group. In the world, there are 19,500 species of Fabaceae, the bean or legume plant family. Now, this is one to add to your list as a pretty important big one. This is the third largest plant family in the world, behind orchids and another group that we haven't talked about yet. So orchids are number 1, another group is number 2, which we'll talk about in a couple videos. And then Fabaceae, this is the third most species-rich plant family. It's also the third most species-rich plant family in Alabama. The first most rich plant family is the Poaceae in Alabama, and the second one is another family that we'll talk about later. This plant family occurs throughout the entire world. Pretty much everywhere you go except for the poles, you'll be able to find members of the Fabaceae. Now, what kinds of things have made them so successful? Well, one of the traits that many members of the Fabaceae have are that their seeds are very persistent. They can last a long time in a seed bank, and they can germinate after hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. There have been seeds of members of the Fabaceae that have been buried by ancient cultures, and they've recently germinated. Another thing that makes this family super successful is that many of them are nitrogen fixing. They have an association with bacteria in the soil that allow them access to nitrogen that other plants don't necessarily get. That means that they can occupy some pretty poor environments and still do very, very well. Now, what's distinctive about this group is not the production of nitrogen or not the fact that they have these long-term seeds, but what's distinctive about this group is the typical pea-shaped flower. This is a modified flower. The 5 petals are modified, and 2 of them are these structures that look like banners. And here you see an example in Chinese wisteria. 2 others look like a little wing that oftentimes encloses the 3rd petal, which is known as a keel. And the keel is what houses the other rest of the whorls of the flower. Now here we've got spring vetch, a plant that is fairly common weed that you'll be able to see in lots of places. Kudzu is a member of this family, and these are kudzu flowers. So a lot of them you can see have this kind of banner and keel kind of floral structure. Another thing, of course, that makes Fabaceae unique is that every one of their seeds are legumes. So remember that these are seeds that are dry, they're dehiscent, and when they split apart, they split along 2 sutures. So let's talk about those fruits a little bit more. So I mentioned one of the distinctive features of Fabaceae is that they've got nitrogen-fixing nodules. Their fruit is always a legume. That might be like a peanut or like a bean pod kind of thing. Many of them have ballistic dispersal, and I've shown you pictures or videos of this earlier on. Many of the leaves of these plants also have stipules, so they tend to be compound leaves, and they also tend to have paired stipules at the base of those compound leaves. There are other kinds of Fabaceae that have flowers that you wouldn't immediately recognize as having this little banner and keel structure to them. Red clover, for example, does actually have that, but you have to look very, very closely. The inflorescence is made up of dozens to maybe even hundreds of those tiny little banner and keel flowers. But there are other lineages in the Fabaceae that don't have the same clear modification. If you look real closely at the flowers of mimosa or purple prairie clover, another species which you may see along roadsides, those species don't necessarily have the exact same kind of floral structure, but those are different sublineages of the Fabaceae. Typically, you can see the flower structure that I showed you here for many members of North American Fabaceae. Now, the utility of members of the Fabaceae is largely in food. So we're talking about beans and peas, many kinds of different beans. So these are pretty big, important food sources for people throughout the world. There are also some of members of this family that are used in dyes and medicines and things like that, but in general their biggest utility is in. Let's move on to a couple woody plant families, the Fagaceae and the Juglandaceae. First of all, the Fagaceae, which is the oak family. Now, sometimes people will ask, how much does spelling matter when we're trying to remember the different plant families? Well, Fabaceae and Fagaceae only differ by 1 letter, so in that case it really matters a lot. So it's important to pay attention to spelling, at least in some cases. Members of the Fagaceae are in the oak family. Now that includes American beech, a plant that we saw earlier on. It doesn't really look like an oak, but it's related genetically to a lot of the oaks that we have. There's about 800 species in the world, so not a super rich plant family. 88 in the US, and in Alabama we've got 44 members of the Fagaceae. 39 of those species are oaks. We have 39 different species of oaks in Alabama. That's a lot. Oaks are a very small family in general, sort of representative of the world's plant diversity. They're a very, very small slice, yet we have 39 different species of oaks in Alabama. They can be difficult to identify. If we focus entirely on the oaks, what makes them unique is that they are trees, they are all trees, and they all have acorns. Another feature that is helpful for identifying oaks is that they have multiple scales on their buds, and they typically cluster the buds together at the tip of a twig, which is also means that they're going to cluster their leaves together at the end of a twig. This particular oak is known as the southern red oak, or Quercus falcata, and we're going to talk a little bit about the structure of the falcate tip right here when we see them in lab. Now, most of the members of the Fagaceae are woody, well they are all woody, and most of them are monoecious. So monoecious means that we've got one individual which will have female flowers in one part of the plant and male flowers in another part of the plant. So what are they useful for? Well, we've got a lot of species of oaks that are used for wood. If you think about wildlife and the consumption of acorns by wildlife, deer and squirrels and things like that, then they're great food for the wildlife that oftentimes people like to hunt. Historically, the tannins, the defense compounds made by the acorns of and the leaves of oak trees were highly used to tan leather and sort of preserve leather, but typically nowadays we use other chemical methods for tanning leather. The next family is the Juglandaceae. Now this has very few plants in it, 59 in the world, 21 in the US, 13 in Alabama, so Alabama contains a pretty large portion of the representatives of Juglandaceae. This is the hickory and walnut family. So we have actually quite a few numbers of hickories throughout our forests in the southeast, and one of the characteristics of the southeastern forests is that when they are left alone, the endpoint of that successional process will be typically a mixture of oaks and hickories in that older forest type. So although the oaks and the hickories don't have a ton of species in them, they often are very characteristic of our forest. They are in high abundance of oaks and hickory individuals in our forests here. These are all trees with compound leaves. So there are other trees that have compound leaves, like the members of the ash family, but these guys all have compound leaves and they're alternating leaves. They are used for wood, and some things like pecans and walnuts, which are members of this family, are used as food. And like the Fagaceae, these are all monoecious. So they have male flowers and female flowers. Hickories are used for all sorts of specialized wood uses like baseball bats and any other case where the wood needs to be extremely dense. Hickories tend to be very, very, very hard wooded species. Next family is another real big one. This is the Rosaceae. You can see from the worldwide distribution map that they also occur everywhere in the world. So pretty much anywhere you go, you're going to be able to find a member of the Rosaceae. Now the Rosaceae is super diverse. It includes herbaceous things like strawberries. It includes a lot of different kinds of trees like apples and cherries and things like that. There's around 3,000 or so species in the world, almost 1,000 in the US alone, and over 100 in Alabama. It's a pretty diverse group of plants, so it's going to be fairly high on your list, although it won't make the top 5 probably. What's distinctive about them is that they pretty much all contain some levels of cyanogenic glycosides. Now when we talked about different kinds of defense compounds in the medicinal section of class, I mentioned that cyanogenic compounds are compounds that produce cyanide. And they're glycosides because they have a sugar molecule attached to them. And so when the herbivore or frugivore consumes the tissue, the sugar is cleaved off of the compound and it becomes sort of activated. A lot of our food, especially our fruits, come from the Rosaceae. So there's a long list of things that are important or useful members of this group. Apples, as we've got in the picture here, and strawberries, but also pears, almonds, cherries, peaches, blackberries, raspberries, etc. A lot of food is produced by members of the Rosaceae. Now there are a few of these species that have been used to produce medicines. For example, laetrile, a drug that is used in treating some forms of cancer, comes from apricot seeds, and apricots are in this family. Another group, which I include just because we see it in several locations, especially around Alabama, but it's not a real important group worldwide, and not a lot that's unique about it either. So I include it because you're likely to see it a lot, and there are some somewhat distinctive features about it, but it's just a real common tree. So there's only about 200 species of Ulmaceae, or elms, in the entire world, 24 in the US, 8 different species in Alabama. What's distinctive about them? Not really that much. Not all of them will have this. Some members of the Ulmaceae have berry-like fruits, but a lot of them have these little winged samaras. And you've probably seen these kind of stuck to your car, especially early to mid-spring. These samaras have little hairs on the outside, and that aids in their dispersal and their wind-dispersed seeds. So again, not a lot that stands out of this family. It is also somewhat unique and somewhat interesting in that it tends to be a northern hemisphere plant. Very few that are native. Very few that are native to the southern hemisphere. Mostly they're northern hemisphere native. Now there is one medicinal plant that occurs in the Ulmaceae, and it's not even used that much for medicinals anymore, but it's something called the slippery elm. The slippery elm contains some compounds that when humans chew on them, they make sort of a mucilaginous, slippery feeling in your throat that used to be used to treat sore throats and coughs. So in wrapping up the rosids, I want to talk about two more plant families. One of them super important, the Brassicaceae. Members of the Brassicaceae, or the mustard family, have very distinctive, unique, four-petaled flowers. You can see they're kind of arranged in a cross. And if you look very closely at the stamens, they have kind of a different arrangement to them as well. You'll have to look very closely at them. But all of these are herbs, and these herbs produce a lot of foods that we use. So things that are in the Brassicaceae include broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, turnips, radishes, and canola. Canola is often made into oil, so vegetable oil is typically from the members of the Brassicaceae. One other plant is kind of important in this group, Arabidopsis. Now, Arabidopsis is one that you may or may not have heard of, but you've probably learned something about plants by someone's study of Arabidopsis. It is the lab rat of the plant world. Probably more money has been spent on Arabidopsis than almost any other single plant research species. So it's a very important plant. We've learned a ton about how plants function in general by studying this tiny little weed. The centers of diversity for members of the Brassicaceae is largely in the Mediterranean region, but you can see that they occur natively throughout the entire world. Pretty big group, 4,200 species worldwide. US has a lot of different species of Brassicaceae, and Alabama does too, nearly 80 different species. They're in all sorts of habitats, from rich forested habitats to dry, glady, rocky habitats, so they're quite diverse. All of them are herbaceous though, as I said earlier. Now, one of the things that is distinctive about the members of the mustard family is that they all produce these mustard oil glycosides. Now, some of them will produce more than others. If you think about horseradish, it's a very spicy plant, but if you think about beets, you don't really think about beets as being very spicy. But lots of things like horseradish and wasabi are very, very spicy, and like I said, all of them produce these mustard oil glycosides. As glycosides, it's your metabolism that breaks them down. It cleaves the sugar, and when it cleaves the sugar, you get that sort of explosive taste in your head where it feels like your sinuses are going to burst. That comes from the release of these mustard oils that are produced by these plants. Okay, last member of the rosids, and that member is the Anacardiaceae. Now, I include Anacardiaceae not because there's a lot of species. There aren't. There's about 600 in the world, 34 in the US, and thankfully only 9 in Alabama. They range throughout the world, as you can see, northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere. They don't do great in deserts, but they get around. They're pretty much throughout the world. This includes members of the poison ivy family. So all members of this family produce an oil called urushiol. Some members of this family, like poison ivy and poison oak and poison sumac, produce a lot more of this oil. Other members, like fragrant sumac over here, looks a lot like poison ivy, but produces such low levels of urushiol that most people are not allergic to it at all. One distinctive feature of many members of the Anacardiaceae, not all, but many of them, have this trifoliate leaf structure. So here, this whole thing is a leaf with 3 leaflets. Poison ivy, whole thing is a leaf, 3 leaflets. So leaflets of 3, let it be, works well for poison ivy. They're pretty varied in their life forms. There's some herbs, there's a lot of woody vines, there are some trees and small shrubs. The fruits and nuts of some of these plants are very useful though. So mangoes are in the Anacardiaceae. Lots of people love mangoes, but cashews are also in this family. Now cashews are not actually a fruit, but they're an accessory part of a fruit. This is a cashew apple, which is an edible thing, and this is the cashew. The cashew has to get separated because there's so much urushiol in these plants. The urushiol is actually problematic if you get exposed to it too much. So lots of people that have to process these things by hand have to wear gloves and masks to avoid any urushiol overdoses. There are some plants like this manchineel tree that produce so much urushiol that pirates used to, supposedly, tie people that they were torturing to the base of this tree and then just let them slowly die in the sun on the beach. A terrible, terrible way to go.